Story 1. The Garden Watchers. I never believed in gnomes or any sort of mythical creatures until the day I moved into an old farmhouse in the countryside. The house was secluded, nestled between towering trees and surrounded by a sprawling garden. My husband and I had been looking for a place to settle, away from the chaos of city life, and this seemed perfect. It was a peaceful spot, at least that's what I thought. The first night, I was awake late, unpacking some things in the living room. Through the window, I could see the dim glow of moonlight reflecting off the garden. That's when I saw them. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. There were tiny, shadowed figures in the garden, no bigger than children. Their heads were round, their eyes large and glowing faintly. They wore tattered clothes that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. But the strangest thing was their faces, those sharp, unnerving smiles that never wavered, as if they were watching me, waiting for something. I chalked it up to exhaustion, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks after the stress of moving. But the next night, it happened again. This time, there were more of them. 10, maybe 12, standing in the garden, staring directly at the house. I froze, heart racing. I couldn't bring myself to move closer to the window, and I definitely didn't want to step outside. For weeks, this continued. I would catch glimpses of them, never closer than the garden's edge, but always watching, never blinking. One day, I finally decided to confront the situation. Armed with nothing but a flashlight, I stepped outside into the garden during the daylight hours. At first, there was nothing. But then, as I walked deeper, I found something chilling, a set of tiny, well-worn footprints leading around the house and back toward the trees. I turned around, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. There were no gnomes in sight, but I could feel their presence, like they were lurking just out of view, waiting to make their move. I didn't stay long after that. We left the house within the week. I don't know what those creatures were, but I do know this. Gnomes are real, and they are watching. Story 2. The Gnome in the Woods. I grew up in a small town surrounded by woods, dense, untamed forests that stretched on for miles. There were always rumors, whispers about strange things happening out there. Eerie lights, disappearing animals, and the occasional mention of little creatures hiding in the shadows. Everyone talked about the gnomes, but I didn't believe in them. That is, until one afternoon when I ventured into the woods with some friends. We were just out for a casual hike, enjoying the fresh air and the sounds of birds chirping. The woods were quiet, too quiet, but it didn't bother us. We were too busy exploring. As we walked, we noticed something odd, a small clearing deep in the forest that none of us recognized. In the center of the clearing was a large, stone circle, covered in moss and overgrown with ivy, and scattered around the circle were tiny, weathered statues, gnomes. They were perfectly still, frozen in place, but something about them didn't sit right with me. The way their eyes seemed to follow us, it was unnatural. We laughed it off at first, making jokes about creepy garden decor. But as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the atmosphere grew heavier. We could hear rustling in the bushes, the sound of something moving. At first, we thought it was just a deer or a raccoon, but then we saw them, tiny figures darting between the trees. They were fast, too fast for any human, and they were moving toward us. My friends didn't seem to notice at first, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw one of them, no more than 3 feet tall, with a long, crooked nose and a dirty, patchwork cloak. It stood still for a moment before disappearing into the underbrush, blending into the shadows like it had never been there. I wanted to leave, but my friends insisted we stay. The air was thick with tension, and my instincts told me we were not alone. Suddenly, one of my friends screamed. I spun around to see him stumbling backward, his face pale with fear. Behind him, standing just at the edge of the clearing, were 2 gnomes, their faces twisted into grotesque, malicious grins. Their eyes glowed with an eerie yellow light, and they were slowly advancing toward us. We ran. We didn't look back, but we could hear them, little footsteps chasing us through the trees. When we finally made it out of the woods, none of us spoke. We didn't need to. The gnomes had made their presence known. Story 3. The Gnome in the Basement. It was a quiet night when I first noticed something strange in the basement. We had recently moved into a Victorian-style house, the kind with all the creaking floors and hidden corners. I loved it at first. There was a sense of charm to it, an old-world beauty that made it feel like something out of a novel. But there was a room in the basement that I always avoided. It wasn't large, just a small, stone-walled space beneath the stairs. The door to it was old, covered in dust, and the lock was rusted. I never thought much of it until one evening, while I was cleaning, I heard a faint sound coming from the basement. It was a tapping noise, soft at first, but unmistakable. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the house settling. But then the tapping became louder, sharper. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to see what was making the noise. I went downstairs, armed with a flashlight, and opened the basement door. As soon as I stepped inside, the temperature dropped. The air was thick and musty, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just old boxes and furniture covered in sheets. But then, I noticed it. In the far corner, barely visible in the dim light, stood a small figure. A gnome, no taller than 2 feet. The gnome was now standing between me and the stairs, its eyes gleaming with malicious intent. I don't know how long I stood there, terrified, but I knew I had to escape. With my heart pounding in my chest, I lunged for the door, throwing my weight against it. It creaked open just enough for me to slip through, and I bolted up the stairs without looking back. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that the gnome is still down there, watching me from the shadows of the basement. I've never dared to go back down into that room. Something about that little creature felt wrong, like it had a mind of its own, waiting for the next time I would enter its domain.